Well, welcome to the third and final week of our Bonhoeffer class that was put together by Dr. Lori Brandt Hale of Augsburg University. She's the president of the International Bonhoeffer Society, the English section. And we're not using all the materials. The first week we looked at some of the key moments in Bonhoeffer's life. Last week we looked at kind of the major points in Bonhoeffer's theology, which is really a Cliff Notes version of something that was actually quite extensive. But his focus on the other, on responsibility, on grace, all those things, are critical to understanding Bonhoeffer. And then I kind of posed the question, why now? Why Bonhoeffer? And this is a session that Dr. Brandt Hale put together on, in a sense, reading Bonhoeffer today, and also reading Bonhoeffer against something that has come to be known as Christian nationalism, because I think there are parallels between the nationalism kind of out of control that existed in Germany in Bonhoeffer's day, and how the church of Bonhoeffer's day, at least some segments of it, were kind of caught up in that nationalism. We're seeing much of that in our own experience. She points out, and I think it's a point well taken, that you can't just say, "Oh, this is what Bonhoeffer dealt with, and this is what we're dealing with, so we know exactly what to do." Heard a great quote. I think it was Barbara Lundblad the other week at our ministerium day for the New Jersey Synod, who quoted Mark Twain, I believe it was, who said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Maybe I said this before, but that made an impression on me. There's parallels, and that's what we're going to be kind of talking about today. Bonhoeffer, his situation, the parallels, the rhyming that we see in our own time. The first slide just simply introduces, again, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and again, reading Bonhoeffer today. You'll note that he was born in 1906. He was executed, martyred in 1945 on April 9th. And so we're celebrating, or marking, I should say, not celebrating, but marking the 80th anniversary of his death. I mentioned a moment ago the Bonhoeffer's key theological and ethical issues. The second slide shows that, beginning in the upper right-hand corner, the focus on the other and the neighbor, and then and community, Christ existing as community, the church as community. Communion of Saints was the title of his first doctoral dissertation. And then the concept of grace, and freedom, not from anything, but freedom for others, and what discipleship is all about. And finally, responsibility, and all of these things, kind of that circle that just keeps repeating itself, and one feeds into another over and over again. And in the middle is sort of Christ-centered justice. The next slide, entitled Holocaust, and that was one of the things. She put, this is a little bit messy, but she put in some of the events that we talked about in week one into where they fit into that chart. So with his brother Walter's death during the First World War, Bonhoeffer started asking some big questions, and it's about that time that he decided to become a pastor. He the focus on the other or the neighbor, was very much a part of his imprisonment at Tegel in 1943. The idea of Christ existing as community was, to a large extent, informed by his year of study at Union Seminary in 1930, and made friends like Frank Fisher and Jean Lasserre and others, where his assumptions about race and nationalism and pacifism were challenged by new friends and experiences. So while Bonhoeffer and also his own family were immediately afraid of the rise of Nazism, there still was German pride. and that was something that he had to struggle with. He never bought into the Nazi ideology, but he certainly was a proud German and had to question some of that. Was there a calling greater than one's calling to their homeland or their nation? And of course, ultimately, he discovered that there was. There at the bottom, it talks about how he questioned those who went along with Hitler, who came to power in 1933. Within days of Hitler's rise to power, Bonhoeffer was giving a radio address on how the leader in German, Führer, could become a misleader. A radio broadcast that was cut off strangely before he finished it. Some say because he overran his time, other because there was already attempts made to stifle that kind of a voice. Under grace, the seminary, illegal seminary that he operated at Finkenwald was where he really wrote about the cost of discipleship, and it was a chance to really understand and work on what it means to be Christian community. So another work that came out of that experience was his little book called Life Together. Kristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass in 1938 was just an example of the increasing hostility towards Jews that ultimately led to the Holocaust. He joined the Abwehr, which was the German military intelligence, in 1940, in part to avoid the draft, in a sense to spare him from that, but he also acted as kind of a double agent. So he came to understand that he had a responsibility because of his Christian faith. The next slide says, an account at the turn of the year 1942-43, there's a quote from Letters and Papers from Prison in which he said, the ultimately responsible question is not how I extricate myself heroically from a situation, but how a coming generation is to go on living. He saw the dangers, not only the dangers of what was happening, but the possible, as it turned out to be, probable suffering and difficulty in years to come. So how do we go on living, especially as Christians? Well, Dr. Brandt Hale asked the question that I posed, why read Bonhoeffer now? Well, he invites community and civic engagement through care for the neighbor. So in a sense, as she writes here, he rejects universal ethical principles for a concrete ethic and order. These are things you live by, and that's what it means to live ethically. And he emphasized more to act on behalf of those specifically who have been marginalized and overlooked. Again, that focus on the other, on the neighbor. He imagined a future and a theology captured in his idea of what was called religionless Christianity, or this worldly Christianity, for the coming generation. So he rejected the fixed claims of religion, again, for a dynamic faith that was always responding, interacting with, and lived out in the midst of life's joys and sufferings. And so Bonhoeffer opposes Christian nationalism. He did then. His reading Bonhoeffer today, he's opposed to the kind of Christian nationalism we're confronted with in our own time, because he rejects the claims to absolute truth and power that often define, or not often, that typically define Christian nationalism. Dr. Jamar Tisby, and I have a note about that here, he's a public historian, author, and research consultant who offers kind of a working definition of Christian nationalism. He says that Christian nationalism is an ethno-cultural ideology that uses Christian symbolism to create a permission structure for the acquisition of political power and social control. Well, we'll see this in a second. It's neither Christian nor nationalism in the sense of many of us would think of nationalism as patriotism. It's not patriotism, and it's not Christian, but it uses a lot of the symbols and words of both of those in a different way. The next slide has something that our ELCA presiding bishop, Elizabeth Eaton, has said, apparently in November of 2022, that Christian nationalism identifies a human-made government with God's will and seeks privilege specifically for Christians, and many times only white Christians. The next slide is entitled Christians Against Christian Nationalism. That is a group that has been formed. I had an opportunity to be at Gettysburg United Lutheran Seminary, the Gettysburg campus, and was privileged to hear Amanda Tyler, who wrote the book How to End Christian Nationalism, and was part of the founding of this group, Christians Against Christian Nationalism. Definition here as well, that Christian nationalism seeks to merge Christian and American identities, distorting both the Christian faith and America's constitutional democracy. Christian nationalism demands Christianity be privileged by the state and implies that to be a good American, one must be Christian. It often overlaps with and provides cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. The next slide, entitled Sympathizers and Adherents of Christian Nationalism. In 2023, the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, conducted a survey aimed at understanding the threat of Christian nationalism to American democracy and culture. And they released the results, they found that, we'll see this in a moment about how much of the population, but here are some of the typical things that they found that kind of define, other than just descriptive ways, that sympathizers and adherents of Christian nationalism believe, first of all, that the U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation. We hear that all the time. It was never founded to be such, and never has been. It has always been, in so many ways, a melting pot, not only of different peoples, but of different traditions and also different religions. That U.S. laws should be based on Christian values. That if the U.S. moves away from our Christian foundations, we'll not have a country anymore. How often do we hear people, and unfortunately politicians included, saying such things? Being Christian is an important part of being truly American, and that God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. Well, the next slide shows, it has a graph showing the results of the Public Religion Research Institute. The percent of people who are adherents is about 10%. Of the population, sympathizers 19%. The largest number are skeptics who have some real questions about that, and 29% totally reject it. And then there's about 4% that really didn't score or didn't respond. So the next slide, PRRI survey on Christian nationalism. The survey also examines how Christian nationalist views intersect with white identity and anti-black sentiment, support of patriarchy, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim sentiments, anti-immigration attitudes, I'm hearing so much about that today, authoritarianism, and support for violence. Additionally, the survey explores the influence of Christian nationalism has within our two primary political parties and major religious subgroups, and what this reveals about the state of American democracy and also the health of our society. The next slide, again, ELCA presiding Bishop Elizabeth Eaton. Christian nationalism identifies a human-made government with God's will and seeks privileges specifically for Christians, many times only white Christians. But she adds, Lutherans teach that government should be held accountable to God, but never dictated as God's will. Then in bold italics, we must remain committed to strengthening the public space as a just place for all who seek peaceful governance, regardless of religion or worldview, and we will defend the full participation of all in our religiously diverse society. The next slide, Christians against Christian nationalism again. Christian nationalism seeks to merge Christian and American identities, distorting both the Christian faith and America's constitutional democracy. Again, Christian nationalism demands Christianity be privileged by the state, implies that to be a good American, one must be Christian. It often overlaps with and provides cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. We heard this just a moment ago, but then it adds this: we reject this damaging political ideology, invite our Christian brothers and sisters to join us in opposing this threat to our faith and to our nation. And while opposing it is not simply up to Christians, I started reading Amanda Tyler's book, How to End Christian Nationalism, and when they brought faith groups together, it was decided that that the best group to make this critique and this resistance were Christians. If any other religious group, Muslim, Jew, the Jewish faith, whatever, they could be accused of being anti-Christian. But if Christians themselves were to make a critique and point out the flaws and the dangers of Christian nationalism, that it was felt. And so that's how they proceeded. Dr. Jemar Tisby, again, that we saw just a moment ago, another slide. White Christian nationalism is the greatest threat to democracy and the witness of the church in the United States today. Well, the next slide says, sound familiar? Again, think of the Mark Twain quote, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. A quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer from May of 1944. Our church has been fighting during these years only for its self-preservation, as if that were an end in itself. It has become incapable of bringing the word of reconciliation and redemption to humankind and to the world. And that was one of the things that there was a portion of the Christian church in Germany that bought into the whole Nazi ideology. There were others who resisted, but their resistance at times and overall was more about preserving themselves than to really speaking against really what came down to be the horrors of the Nazi regime. Again, Dr. Jemar Tisby, paraphrased, is the next slide. Christian nationalism uses Christianity, including the symbols of Christianity, to acquire and assert power and control. Well, the next slide, 1930-31 Union Theological Seminary in New York City. There's a picture of Union Seminary. There's also a photo of Jean Lasserre and Dietrich Bonhoeffer standing together. Jean Lasserre was a French pacifist who challenged Bonhoeffer's reading of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Lasserre confronted Bonhoeffer with new ideas about the relationship between the biblical text and God's Word and living out that Word as a citizen of the world. He called Bonhoeffer to take Jesus' peace commandment seriously. And so by November of 1930, on Armistice Day, which celebrated the end of the First World War, Bonhoeffer preached at a Methodist church in Yonkers, New York, and began to articulate what would become his own ecumenical peace ethic. So again, especially with some a written biography by Eric Metaxas, which I do not recommend, because I think he misuses Bonhoeffer, and the recent movie, which I think has some fatal flaws that depict Bonhoeffer as being more aggressively, an assassin or a spy, or whatever. is to ignore his deep commitment to peace and the struggles that he had in how best to respond, especially as the years went by. Here is from this sermon on November 11th, 1930, is the next slide. I stand before you not only as a Christian, but also a German who loves his home best of all, who rejoices with his people and who suffers when he sees his people suffering, who confesses gratefully that he received from his people all that he has. So he was clearly proud of his German identity. But he went on to say, you have brothers and sisters in our people and in every people. Do not forget that. Come what may, let us never more forget that our Christian people is the people of God, that if we are in accord, no nationalism, no hate of races or classes can execute its designs, and then the world will have its peace forever and ever. The next slide, entitled Jean Lasserre, 1953. So this is 8 years after Bonhoeffer's execution. He wrote, nothing in the scriptures gives the Christian authority to tear apart the body of Christ for the state or anything else. One cannot be Christian and nationalist. And I'm reminded, I can't remember chapter and verse, but in the book of Acts, there's a moment where the apostles are confronted, and they basically say that that we have to obey God rather than men, others. So one can be a patriot, but our ultimate allegiance is to Christ and to God. And if ever they come in conflict, one's primary allegiance is to our faith. And so the next slide asks the question, is this a Bonhoeffer moment? A lot of people have been asking that question. In fact, people on the other side of the political spectrum, some people, I believe it was this Eric Metaxas, who said that, that if the Democratic candidate, Kamala Harris, had won the election, it would have been a Bonhoeffer moment, that there should have been a resistance, to her presidency, while others see the ultimate winner of the election as being someone to resist. Dr. Laurie Brandt Hale, however, offers that that's the wrong question. Again, history doesn't repeat itself, it does rhyme. But Bonhoeffer's question, the more appropriate question, she would argue, is who is Christ for us today? And then that brings us back to his key theological and ethical ideas. As she writes, for me, Bonhoeffer's Christ-centered, justice-focused neighbor ethic theology is clear. Who is Christ for us today? All the peoples, even the outcasts, even the suffering. And so the next slide says, who is Christ for us today? All the peoples. For me, writes Bonhoeffer, the main issue for individuals and for peoples is whether or not they have learned to live with other human beings and peoples. That's more important to me than all their ideas, thoughts, and convictions. And so it's learning how to live with each other, how one can be a Christian and still love and serve and care for others, even those who are not Christian. And so, who is Christ for us today? Think of Jesus, and we had the parable of the Good Samaritan, and the lawyer wanting to justify himself. Well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus tells a story about a hated Samaritan, an outcast, somebody they would have looked down on and frowned upon. is the one who helps the man who was beaten and left for dead by the side of the road. And he said, well, Jesus masterfully turns the question on the questioner, the lawyer, and says, well, who was the neighbor to this man? The answer is obvious. Well, the man who stopped to help him and take care of him and took him to the inn and paid to have him nursed back to health. And Jesus' response was, go and do likewise. It's not who is my neighbor, but to whom can I be a neighbor? Again, Bonhoeffer came to focus not so much on ideals as being Christ in the world and serving others in Christ's name, and loving and caring and serving. That's what it means to be a Christian. Well, we'll end there, and you're invited to come this Sunday, Palm Sunday, between the services at about 10:15 or so till 10:45. We'll have a conversation about this, and but even if you're not, hopefully you have a chance to you're watching it, I guess. Hopefully this is helpful for you and gives you a little bit of insight into the life and the legacy of that German Lutheran pastor and theologian and martyr, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Until Sunday, take care. Hope you can join us. If not, hope that this was helpful and to some degree enlightening. Take care.